The earth trembled. Deep within the limestone caverns of Bavaria, where Messerschmitt's underground factory floor stretched into darkness, the sound rolled through like distant thunder. Above ground, Allied bombers painted the morning sky with contrails of destruction. Below, German engineers had gathered around something far more dangerous than any falling bomb: a downed American P-47 Thunderbolt. Chief Engineer Klaus Hoffman circled the wreckage with predatory focus. His fingers traced the bullet holes that had finally brought the beast down over the Ruhr Valley, but his eyes betrayed something between admiration and fear. Before a lucky shot severed its hydraulic lines, this single aircraft had carved through 3 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters. Even dying, it had limped 40 kilometers before gravity claimed its final victory. "Impossible," muttered Werner Schultz, Hoffman's assistant, barely audible above the distant bombs. 7 tons. It should fall like a brick, yet it dances with our best fighters and wins. Hoffman knelt beside the engine cowling. With practiced efficiency, he pried open the access panels. What he discovered made his breath catch: a system of tubes and injectors. Simple, almost primitive, yet it spoke of an engineering philosophy entirely foreign to German military doctrine. The factory lights flickered as another wave of bombers passed overhead. Hoffman ignored the warning klaxons, consumed by the mechanical mystery before him. The Thunderbolt's reputation had grown into legend among Luftwaffe pilots. They called it Die Jug, a nickname borrowed from the Americans themselves, and they feared it with good reason. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, where thin air should have strangled its massive radial engine, the Thunderbolt somehow found impossible reserves of power. "Bring me Oberst Fischer," Hoffman commanded, still staring at the injection system. Immediately, within the hour, Luftwaffe Colonel Heinrich Fischer descended into the underground workshop, his uniform bearing dust from the surface bunkers. His face showed the exhaustion of a man who had watched German air superiority evaporate over 18 months. The Americans had been producing Thunderbolts at a rate that defied economic logic. Republic Aviation's Farmingdale facility alone was completing more than 10 aircraft daily by mid-1943. Fischer approached the dissected engine with the cautious respect of a man who had seen too many coffins draped in the black cross of the Luftwaffe. "What am I looking at, Hoffman?" "The reason we're losing the air war." Hoffman's voice carried no emotion. "The Americans have given their fighters a secret weapon, and we've been too blind to see it. They're not just injecting fuel into these engines, Herr Oberst. They're injecting water." The colonel's expression shifted from exhaustion to disbelief. "Water? You're telling me the Americans are drowning their engines to make them stronger?" "Not drowning. Cooling. Supercharging. Transforming." Hoffman gestured at the maze of pipes. "When they need emergency power, when our fighters close for the kill, they inject a mixture of water and methanol directly into the engine cylinders. The water evaporates instantly, absorbing tremendous heat, allowing them to increase manifold pressure beyond any sustainable limit. For 5 minutes, perhaps 10, this 7-ton monster becomes something else entirely." Fischer leaned closer, his trained eye now seeing what the engineer described. The implications crashed through his military consciousness like the bombs above. Every engagement report suddenly made terrible sense. American pilots diving away from seemingly certain destruction, then climbing back with impossible acceleration, leaving pursuing Messerschmitts gasping for air in their wake. Act 2. Analysis. August 2018, 1943, Reichsministerie, Berlin. 3 weeks later, the captured Thunderbolt rested in pieces across a dozen analysis stations within the Reich Air Ministry's technical division. Hoffman had transported his prize to the capital with all the ceremony of an archaeologist presenting an emperor's tomb. Around him, Germany's finest aeronautical minds gathered in a converted ballroom. Crystal chandeliers bizarrely juxtaposed against workbenches covered in engine components and measurement instruments. Reichsminister Albert Speer himself had authorized the assembly, pulling engineers from every corner of the crumbling Reich. The invasion of Italy was less than 3 weeks away. Soviet forces pressed from the east with renewed fury. American bomber formations darkened German skies with increasing frequency. The Luftwaffe desperately needed an advantage, any advantage to stem the tide. "Gentlemen," Hoffman began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space, "what you see before you is not merely an engine. It is a philosophy of warfare that we fundamentally misunderstood." He gestured to detailed schematics his team had drafted through weeks of sleepless analysis. The Americans accepted from the beginning that their fighter would be heavy. They didn't chase the elegant efficiency we prize in the Focke-Wulf or Messerschmitt. Instead, they built a flying fortress around a single pilot, then gave it a trick that temporarily transforms mass into momentum. Dr. Wilhelm Messerschmitt, legendary designer of the Bf 109, stood with arms crossed, expression skeptical. "And you believe this water injection is scalable, practical for mass production?" "The Americans are already producing it at mass scale," Hoffman countered. "Republic Aviation has delivered over 6,000 Thunderbolts since its introduction. Every single one carries this system. While we debate theoretical efficiency, they manufacture practical dominance." A younger engineer named Otto Bremer raised his hand timidly. "But surely the system adds weight, complexity, points of failure?" Hoffman nodded. "Approximately 200 pounds of additional equipment and fluid capacity. Yet consider what it purchases. The psychological advantage of knowing that at any moment their pilot can summon power we cannot match. Our pilots break off attacks, not because they lack skill, but because they've learned through blood that the Thunderbolt can bite back when cornered." The room fell silent. Speer stepped forward, his political mind already calculating implications. How long to retrofit our current fighters? The silence deepened. Hoffman exchanged glances with Messerschmitt before answering. "To design, test, and implement across existing production? 8 months minimum. Realistically, 12. And that assumes unlimited access to materials we no longer possess in sufficient quantities." 8 months, Speer repeated quietly, as if testing how the words tasted. "In 8 months, how many more pilots will we lose to this advantage?" No one answered. The mathematics were too grim to speak aloud. Messerschmitt broke the silence with characteristic directness. "We should have captured one of these cursed machines a year ago when they first appeared over France. Now we analyze their secrets while Allied bombs turn our factories to rubble." He pointed at the disassembled engine. But Hoffman is correct. This is not merely technology. It is doctrine. The Americans built a fighter that accepts disadvantages we would never tolerate, then gave it a trump card that cancels those disadvantages at critical moments. Act 3. Testing. September 17th, 1943, Rechlin Test Facility. Autumn chill brought morning fog to the airfield at Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's primary testing facility. Hoffman stood beside a modified Focke-Wulf 190A-5, watching mechanics make final adjustments to the crude water injection system his team had fabricated. The prototype looked almost comical. Additional tanks bolted beneath the fuselage, pipes running externally where German engineers would prefer internal elegance. Pressure gauges installed on the instrument panel with hand-painted markings. Test pilot Hermann Edward Neumann approached with the relaxed confidence of a man who had survived 200 combat missions. His face bore the leather-tan texture of countless hours at high altitude, his eyes carrying the particular weariness of watching too many wingmen die. "It won't explode, Herr Hoffman?" he asked with dark humor. "Probably not," Hoffman replied with equal dryness. "The Americans have been flying with this system for over a year without significant incident rates. Our version is less refined, but the principles are sound." Neumann circled the modified fighter, running his hand along the additional plumbing. "In combat, elegance matters less than survival. If this trick gives me 10 more seconds of power when an American is on my tail, I'll gladly fly with an outhouse bolted to my wings." The test protocol was simple in theory. Climb to 25,000 feet, push the BMW 801 engine to maximum continuous power, then engage the water injection system and measure the performance increase. Simple in theory. In practice, they were asking a German engine to perform feats it was never designed to accomplish, relying on calculations derived from hasty measurements of enemy technology. At precisely 0800 hours, Newman's Focke-Wulf roared down the runway, trailing vapor in the cold morning air. Hoffman and his team monitored from the control tower, clipboards ready, stopwatches synchronized. The fighter climbed steeply, its BMW engine screaming with characteristic Germanic precision. Altitude 20,000 feet, reported the radio operator, translating Newman's comm updates. Engine temperature nominal, oil pressure nominal, engaging water injection system now. Through binoculars, Hoffman watched the distant fighter suddenly leap forward as if kicked by an invisible giant. Even from miles away, the change in engine note was audible, a deeper, more aggressive roar that spoke of power beyond standard specifications. The Focke-Wulf climbed at an angle that should have been impossible, its rate of ascent increasing dramatically. Manifold pressure 1.42 atmospheres. Newman's voice crackled through the radio. Temperature dropping despite increased power. This is remarkable. I have 30% more power available, perhaps more. For 3 minutes, the test continued perfectly. Then the engine note changed. A harsh metallic screaming that made every mechanic in the tower wince simultaneously. Engine seizure. Newman shouted, professional comm cracking. Cylinder head temperature critical. Disengaging water system. The wreckage of Hermann Newman's fighter lay scattered across a potato field 7 kilometers from Rechlin Airfield, a testament to both German engineering and its limitations. Newman himself sat in the medical tent with minor burns and a sprained wrist, considerably better off than his aircraft. The BMW 801 engine had literally torn itself apart at altitude, its cylinder heads warping under thermal stress that German metallurgy could not withstand. October 3rd, 1943, crash site investigation. Hoffman stood in the debris field, holding a twisted connecting rod that had punched through the engine, cowling with enough force to embed itself in the firewall. Around him, recovery crews picked through scattered components, while Luftwaffe officers documented every failure point with grim thoroughness. The Americans used different alloys, muttered Dr. Friedrich Schuster, a metallurgist from Krupp Steel who had joined the investigation. He examined a fragment of the American Thunderbolt cylinder head under portable magnifying equipment. Their cylinders contain molybdenum, vanadium, trace elements we've been conserving for armor production. They can withstand thermal cycling that turns our best steel into brittle scrap. Hoffman felt the weight of impossibility settling on his shoulders. The water injection principle worked. Newman's 3 minutes of enhanced performance proved that conclusively. But implementing it across the Luftwaffe required materials Germany no longer possessed in sufficient quantities, manufacturing precision that Allied bombing had disrupted, and time that the Reich did not have. So we abandoned the project, asked Oberst Fischer, who had traveled from Berlin to witness the test personally. We adapt, Hoffman replied firmly. The Americans built their system for sustained emergency power. We cannot match their materials, but we don't need to. We need enough, 30 seconds, 1 minute perhaps, to give our pilots a chance when they most need it. Act 4. Implementation. Over the following weeks, Hoffman's team redesigned their approach. Instead of constant availability, they developed a single-shot system that could provide one burst of enhanced power before exhausting its water-methanol mixture. Instead of exotic alloys, they used standard German steel, but accepted shorter engine lifespan after activation. Instead of elegant integration, they created a bolt-on kit that could be installed at field workshops without factory support. The result, designated the MW50 system, emerged from testing in late October. It was crude, limited, and represented everything German engineering typically avoided. It was also effective enough to enter limited production. November 20th, 1943, combat over Bremen. The first combat test came over the burning city of Bremen. Lieutenant Hans Müller, a 22-year-old pilot with 7 confirmed kills, climbed through scattered clouds in his modified Focke-Wulf 190A6, watching a formation of American B-17 bombers lumber toward their target with the inevitable patience of mechanical death. Muller's fighter carried one of the first production MW-50 systems, a squat tank behind the cockpit connected to his BMW engine through pipes that mechanics had installed just 3 days prior. A red lever on his left console, safety wired shut, controlled the system. Instructions were simple. Pull the lever only when you need 10 seconds of godlike power. Then pray your engine survives. 12 B-17s, reported Müllers Wingmann, Unteroffizier Karl Schneider. High cover of 4, no, 6, Thunderbolts at 27,000 feet. Muller keyed his radio. We take the bombers from below. Fast pass, then dive away before the jugs react. Understood. They dove from the sun. Twin sharks attacking a whale pod. Muller's cannons hammered into a B-17's wing root, watching pieces separate in the slipstream. Then, as expected, the Thunderbolts fell from above like angry angels, their radial engines bellowing war songs. One fastened onto Muller's tail with professional precision. Tracer rounds snapped past his canopy. Muller yanked his fighter through a barrel roll that should have shaken any pursuer. The Thunderbolt matched him turn for turn, closing steadily. In seconds, it would achieve firing position that no amount of maneuvering could escape. Muller's hand found the red lever. He snapped the safety wire without conscious thought and pulled. The BMW 801 engine seemed to inhale deeply, then roared with fury that Muller had never experienced. His Focke-Wulf leaped forward like a frightened stallion, acceleration pressing him into his seat with crushing force. The Thunderbolt, caught mid-correction, fell behind as if suddenly flying through molasses. For 9 seconds, Muller rode lightning. His fighter climbed at angles that defied physics, outrunning the heavier American with ease. Then, as abruptly as it began, the power surge ended. His engine note returned to normal, warning lights flickering across his instrument panel. Oil temperature critical. Cylinder head temperature dangerously high. But he was alive. The Thunderbolt circled below, its pilot undoubtedly confused by the German fighter's sudden burst of impossible speed. Muller limped back to base on a damaged engine that mechanics would later condemn as unsalvageable. He had survived 1 combat, destroyed 1 bomber, and burned out an engine worth its weight in gold. The mathematics of attrition favored no one. Act V. Reckoning. December 8, 1943, Luftwaffe Operational Headquarters. Snow fell outside the reinforced windows while inside. Commanders confronted statistics that read like obituaries written in advance. Albert Speer presided over the emergency meeting, his face showing the strain of managing an economy being systematically dismantled by Allied bombing. Hoffman presented his report with clinical detachment. As of today, we've installed MW-50 systems on approximately 240 frontline fighters. Combat reports indicate a survival increase of 17% in engagements with Thunderbolts and other water injection-equipped American fighters. He paused, ensuring his next words carried appropriate weight. However, average engine lifespan after MW-50 activation has dropped to 11 flight hours. We're trading long-term capability for short-term survival. General der Flieger Hans Jeschneck, chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff, looked older than his 49 years. Production rates? Speer interjected. Every MW-50 system requires methanol we need for other chemical processes, aluminum we need for airframes, and precision manufacturing capacity that barely exists after the Hamburg firestorms. We can equip perhaps 50 additional fighters monthly. He leaned forward. The Americans are producing 200 Thunderbolts weekly, each one already fitted with superior water injection from the factory. The mathematics hung in the air like poison gas. Germany had learned the Thunderbolt's secret, reverse-engineered a functional imitation, and fielded it to combat pilots. Yet in doing so, they had only illuminated the depth of their strategic deficit. The Americans possessed industrial capacity that allowed them to give every fighter a technological advantage that Germany could barely prototype. Oberst Fischer spoke from bitter experience. Our pilots report that even with MW-50, they're at best equal to American fighters at the moment of activation. The Thunderbolt's water injection system provides sustained power increases for 5 to 8 minutes. Ours exhausts in seconds. We haven't copied their advantage. We've created an expensive approximation. Then what do you propose? Jeschneck demanded. We abandon the program? Tell our pilots they have no answer to American technology. We acknowledge reality, Fisher replied quietly. MW-50 is not a war-winning technology. It's a life-saving one. We should install it on every fighter we can, knowing it will save dozens of pilots. But we should harbor no illusions that it will reverse our strategic position. Hoffman watched the generals absorb this truth. The water injection system they had discovered in that crashed Thunderbolt represented more than clever engineering. It symbolized an entire industrial philosophy that Germany could observe but never match. The Americans built fighters heavy enough to carry their pilots home, then gave them emergency power to escape when trapped. German fighters were lighter, more maneuverable, more efficient in every measurable way, except the one that mattered most, getting their pilots home alive. Act 6, Aftermath. January 11th, 1944, Bavarian caverns. Hoffman returned to the underground facility where his investigation had begun 6 months prior. The Bavarian caverns had survived continued Allied bombing, but the factory floor was now eerily quiet. Production had shifted to dispersed facilities, skilled workers scattered across Germany like seeds in a storm. He stood once more beside the original crashed Thunderbolt, now fully disassembled into component parts, carefully labeled and cataloged. The water injection system that had sparked this entire odyssey rested on a workbench, its elegant simplicity mocking the complexity of German attempts to replicate it. Werner Schultz joined him, carrying the latest combat reports. The younger engineer had aged noticeably over the past months, his enthusiasm tempered by reality. Lieutenant Muller was shot down over France yesterday. He managed to bail out, but his fighter is gone. That was his third aircraft lost since receiving the MW-50 system. He lived 3 times he might have died, Hoffman observed. That is the system working as designed. Or perhaps we're simply postponing the inevitable. Schultz replied with uncharacteristic bitterness. The Americans have moved beyond water injection. Intelligence reports their new P-51 Mustang carries improved systems and achieves performance our fighters cannot approach, even with MW-50 engaged. We spent 6 months learning their old tricks while they developed new ones. Hoffman could not argue. The Mustang represented the next evolution. Longer range, better high-altitude performance, water injection systems integrated from initial design rather than retrofitted. German engineers were perpetually fighting the last war while their opponents invented the next one. Do you regret it? Schultz asked suddenly. All this effort to copy what we found in this wreckage. Hoffman considered the question carefully before answering. I regret that we needed to copy it at all. I regret that we treated American engineering as inferior for so long that we blinded ourselves to their innovations. The Thunderbolt was flying combat missions for 8 months before we seriously analyzed one. Think of that. 8 months of combat data we ignored because we assumed German engineering supremacy. He gestured at the disassembled engine. This machine taught me humility, Werner. The Americans don't build fighters the way we do. They don't prioritize what we prioritize. And for the longest time, we interpreted that as weakness. We mocked their heavy fighters, their radial engines, their emphasis on pilot protection over performance. We called the Thunderbolt a flying milk bottle and assumed it would be easy prey. Until it started killing us, Schultz finished quietly. Until it started killing us, Hoffman agreed. The water injection system is merely the most visible symbol of a larger truth. The Americans fight a different war with different priorities, and those priorities are shaped by an industrial base we cannot match. They can afford to add 200 pounds of emergency power equipment because they have the engines to lift it. They can afford complex systems because they have the manufacturing capacity to build them reliably. They can afford to protect their pilots with armor and redundant systems because they have enough pilots to fly home and fight again. March 6, 1944, Berlin. The skies over Berlin had transformed into a battlefield that would have seemed impossible just 2 years prior. American bombers flew in daylight with impunity, their fighter escorts ranging far beyond what German strategists had believed possible. Hoffman watched from a bunker entrance as contrails painted abstract patterns across the winter sky, each white line representing another American fighter that German industry could not match. The WWII program had saved lives. Of this, there was no doubt. Pilots who would have died in hopeless tail chases now occasionally survived to fight another day. But occasionally was not a strategic advantage. The statistics told a story of inevitable defeat. For every German pilot who used MW-50 to escape an American attack, 3 more died in circumstances where no technological trick could help them. Republic Aviation's Thunderbolt, the machine that had started this entire investigation, had evolved beyond even the example Hoffman had studied. The P-47D model now featured a bubble canopy for better visibility, improved water injection systems that could run for extended periods, and combat radius that allowed it to escort bombers to any target in Germany. The ghost that had haunted Hoffman's investigations had become a very real specter of German defeat. Colonel Fischer visited the bunker that afternoon, carrying orders that surprised no one. The Führer has ordered all remaining resources concentrated on jet fighter development. The Me-262 program receives top priority. Your water injection research is to be concluded. Hoffman nodded slowly. The jets will make water injection obsolete regardless. When your fighter exceeds 500 miles per hour, emergency power from piston engines becomes irrelevant. Perhaps, Fischer agreed, though I note the Americans are also developing jets. And if history is any guide, when we finally field the Me-262, we'll discover the Americans have equipped theirs with some trick we never considered. The observation carried no bitterness, only weary recognition of patterns that had repeated throughout the war. German engineering could match or exceed any single American technology, but could not compete with the systematic innovation that American industry produced. Hoffman retrieved a leather portfolio from his workspace, containing every technical drawing, test report, and analysis his team had completed over 9 months of intensive study. This should be preserved, he said, offering the portfolio to Fischer. Not for this war, but for whatever comes after. These documents represent an expensive education in the dangers of underestimating one's enemy. Fischer accepted the portfolio with appropriate gravity. What will you do now? Return to civilian life, if any exists when this ends, Hoffman replied. Perhaps teach engineering to the next generation. Make certain they understand that elegance without victory is merely defeat with better aesthetics. Through the bunker entrance, another wave of American bombers approached, their escort of Thunderbolts and Mustangs glinting in the afternoon sun. Somewhere up there, Hoffman imagined, were pilots who had never heard of the MW-50 program, who didn't know that German engineers had spent 9 months frantically trying to copy their water injection systems. They flew their heavy fighters with confidence born from industrial superiority and technological advantages their opponents could observe but never match. Epilogue. Lessons. May 8th, 1945. Rechlin Airfield. Silence fell over Germany for the first time in years. The war in Europe had ended, and with it, the desperate chase to match American aviation technology. Hoffman stood in the ruins of the Rechlin Airfield where Hermann Neumann had tested the first MW-50 prototype 18 months earlier. Soviet soldiers occupied the facility now, photographing every document, creating every piece of equipment for shipment eastward. The final accounting made sobering reading. Germany had equipped approximately 900 fighters with MW-50 systems during the war's last year. Those systems had achieved their limited goal. Pilot survival rates in equipped fighters ran 17% higher than in standard aircraft. But against that modest success lay the staggering cost. Materials diverted from other programs, manufacturing capacity that could have produced additional standard fighters, and countless engineering hours spent chasing an advantage the Americans had already moved beyond. More significantly, the program had exposed the fundamental weakness in German military strategy. Even when German engineers successfully copied American technology, they lacked the industrial base to deploy it at meaningful scale. The Thunderbolt that crashed in Bavaria had carried a secret, yes, but the real secret was not water injection. It was the vast industrial machine that could equip thousands of fighters with complex systems while simultaneously developing the next generation of aircraft. A young Soviet officer approached Hoffman, speaking through a translator. "You are the engineer who studied the American fighter?" "I am. We would like you to explain your research." "The Soviet Union is very interested in water injection technology." Hoffman smiled wearily. "The research is all documented. You'll find it makes fascinating reading. I'll tell you what I told my own commanders. The technology works brilliantly, but only if you have the industrial capacity to support it. Study the systems by all means, but study also the factories that built them, the supply chains that fed those factories, and the economic system that made it all possible. That is the real lesson of the Thunderbolt." In the years that followed, aviation historians would debate the significance of Germany's MW-50 program. Some argued it represented a successful example of rapid technology adaptation under wartime pressure. Others maintained it was a wasteful diversion of resources that could have been better spent elsewhere. Both perspectives contained truth. What remained undebatable was the broader lesson. The Thunderbolt had indeed woken something in Germany, but not what German commanders had hoped. The water injection system forced German engineers to confront the reality that their opponents possessed not just individual technological advantages, but an entire system of innovation and production that Germany could not match. The MW-50 program succeeded tactically while failing strategically, saving individual pilots while changing nothing about the war's ultimate trajectory. Hoffman's final report, recovered from archives decades later, concluded with an observation that transcended the immediate technical details. "We approached American aviation technology with the assumption that our engineering philosophy was inherently superior, and that any advantages our opponents possessed resulted from brute force rather than genuine innovation. The Thunderbolt taught us otherwise. Its water injection system was not a crude solution to overcome inferior design. It was an elegant integration of multiple technologies that prioritized pilot survival and combat effectiveness over abstract measures of efficiency. In seeking to copy this system, we learned that we had been answering the wrong questions all along. The crashed Thunderbolt that started this investigation was eventually scrapped for materials in the chaotic final months of the war. Its water injection system, the component that had sparked 9 months of frantic German research, ended up in a scrap heap somewhere in Bavaria, its tubes and pumps recycled into whatever desperate use the dying Reich required. But the lessons endured. Post-war aviation development across the world incorporated water injection and similar emergency power systems, refined and improved based on the American pioneering work that Germany had tried so desperately to match. The Thunderbolt's technological legacy extended far beyond the conflict that spawned it, influencing fighter design for decades. In the end, Germany never expected water injection to wake the Thunderbolt, because Germany never expected to be the student rather than the teacher. The crash fighter in the Bavarian caverns became a mirror that reflected back uncomfortable truths about innovation, industrial capacity, and the dangers of underestimating one's opponents. It was a lesson purchased at the cost of thousands of lives and ultimately learned too late to matter. The thunder had already spoken. No amount of desperate imitation could call back the lightning.